For more on this story, I'm joined from Canberra by Professor John Blaxland, Director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Now, almost a decade ago, Jemaah Islamiyah had declared their aim was to establish an Islamic caliphate in the region. Now we have ISIS making the same declaration. But how much regional support does this group actually command?
Well, it's a very good question. Of course, there's a little bit of jealousy on the Jemaah Islamiyah front because the caliphate was supposed to be in Indonesia, and this is not Indonesia, it's Mindanao in the Philippines. So there's a little bit of rivalry. What we need to understand is this is a local Filipino phenomenon that has an international dimension because of the toxic appeal of Daesh or ISIS. And so the attraction of foreign fighters is a real one. But the challenges are fundamentally about what happens inside the Philippines. And the confluence of factors makes it very hard to tease apart the two dimensions.
At the same time, though, Professor, Mindanao is known to be the region of Abu Sayyaf, of the MILF. It is known to be a hotbed of these particular bandit groups, shall we say. So is it really ISIS that we're dealing with here, or is it just different groups of bandits?
Well, look, it's interesting because the MNLF and the MILF, the Moro National Liberation Front and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, both have struck a deal with the government in Manila, but the government in Manila hasn't really delivered on those promises, and that has actually generated a space for Daesh or ISIS to fill the gap with these other organisations that are being purported and portrayed as having not delivered for the people of Mindanao, the Muslim population inside Mindanao, bearing in mind that not all of Mindanao is actually all Muslim, but that corner of Mindanao where Marawi is certainly is. So there is a real challenge here, and we need to recognise that there is clearly an ideological dimension to this challenge, but there is a fundamental issue of governance behind it that is actually exacerbating the problem. So the failure of the government of Manila for the Philippines to deliver on its promises of basic governance, employment and government services, this is providing the background noise to a cultural clash that is now being painted in terms of the so-called Islamic State.
Now, yesterday we saw ASIO's chief, Nick Warner, in talks with President Duterte. What role do you see Australia playing in regards to either containing or ending the potential spread of ISIS in that country and the region?
Well, what Australia has to do is be mindful of the local sensitivities. We need to be respectful of the wishes of the local people. And we can't just lord it over people and dictate the terms. It's not our turf. We need to be respectfully engaging with the Filipino government, with the people there. And let's not forget, Australia, and this is something that's not really well known or advertised. Australia has had, through the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Aid Program, an extensive program of engagement in Mindanao, helping with education, helping with people who are have limited opportunities, who are underprivileged, and Australia's been really committing tens of millions of dollars to programs that have actually delivered very constructive results. The problem is that this is, essentially a drop in the ocean when you're talking about corruption, when you're talking about unemployment, when you're talking about promises unfulfilled for the people of Mindanao. And then you have a government from Manila that is sending forces to Mindanao that are often portrayed as being Christian against Muslim. And that messaging, of course, reinforces that perception of this being a civilizational one that then makes this about attracting moths to the flame. And so this talk of jihadists coming back from the Middle East or maybe moving over from Indonesia to join in the fight, this is part of the toxic narrative that Daesh or ISIS is trying to foment, which we need to be very, very circumspect about responding to, because it's clearly it's a problem for the Filipino government. Australia can help. We've already been providing the P3 surveillance aircraft with surveillance and reconnaissance and intelligence support. Beyond that, I understand the government may well be considering some additional support, particularly in terms of mentoring, training and advising. But we need to remember that in terms of what military aid Australia can deliver, that has to be put in the context of understanding the root causes of the problem is not being fundamentally military, but being about governance, about respect, about ideology. This is a multifaceted challenge, and Australia, as I say, has been engaging in a very modest and demure manner. Effectively, we haven't been trying to seek the glory for this.
Well, it
tricky,
certainly
though.
puts Australia in a very difficult position diplomatically, I suppose. No doubt the Australia-Philippine cooperation is at the forefront now that ISIS has brought the battle to the south of the Philippines. But does this then leave Australia in a compromising position over President Duterte's human rights record?
Well, this is the conundrum. It's an existential challenge for us in Australia. What are we? Are we prepared to engage with our neighbours the way they are and work respectfully with them to try and get them to lift their standards and to respond to the needs of the people on the ground, as Australia has been doing? Or do we get on the megaphone and, shout at them, you need to change your ways? Well, look, we know, we've seen the government's been under a lot of pressure lately to do something, be loud, make some noise, criticise Duterte. Well, where's that going to get us, folks? If we do that in the public domain, that is completely going to be counterproductive. Now, let's be realistic. The government, our diplomats, are experts at doing this. They know how this works. And Julie Bishop, and I'm sure the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, let alone Maurice Payne in the defence portfolio, and others, will be looking to respectfully and discreetly make the points about governance, about human rights, about respect for basic law, and actually fulfilling your promises. But you do that quietly, behind the scenes. You don't do that through a press announcement. That would be completely counterproductive. And of course, it's very difficult then for the Foreign Minister or the Prime Minister to then say, well, we've already done it behind the scenes, because then you defeat the purpose. It's a tricky conundrum. We in Australia need to respect that our officials, our bureaucrats, our diplomats are onto it. They're doing what they can. But we have a conundrum. We have a situation where if we want to have influence, we need to respect them. We need to recognise the limits of our own power, our own influence, and then try and do something that will have a long-term positive effect.
But it's also very difficult for Australia, particularly now that ISIS has publicly derided Australia as the regional guard dog of America. In this online propaganda video, they basically made a threat to Australia. Does this leave Australia more vulnerable to possible attacks by ISIS supporters?
Look, we are already vulnerable to attack from so-called ISIS supporters. Let's be realistic. This is exactly what you called it, Fauzi. It's propaganda. What do? Do you believe it? Do you buy it? Of course not. You counter it. We need to stand up and say, what a load of baloney. Folks, we need to understand that we're in a fight, we, Australia, along with our regional partners in the Philippines, and we've been doing this in Indonesia respectfully and positively contributing in there and elsewhere in the neighbourhood. This is our patch. Australia needs to respectfully engage it. We need to not shy away from engaging on these issues, but we need to be looking constructively and holistically at the nature of the problem and potential mechanisms that can be employed to help address the now, that's not easy. There's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that's going to solve it. Certainly any additional military Australian support that might be sent might make a positive difference. But essentially, it's a complex one. It's one that has to be solved within the Philippines with the help from Indonesia and Malaysia. This is something that affects the borderline between this. And we've seen a really positive development between Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines in managing that space between them, the Sulu Sea, what some people call the Bangsamoro space. This is a contested space. It's a largely ungoverned space, and it's one where terrorists and jihadists have been transiting routinely lately. Those three countries are working on trying to close that. Australia, I understand, is working bilaterally with those three countries to try and help make that happen. But this is multifaceted. There's financial transactions. So we have an organisation called AUSTRAC. It's really working to try and help Manila as well as Indonesia and Malaysia address this as well.
Right.
Very complicated. a lot going on behind the scenes that the government doesn't want to really advertise for pretty good reasons.
Right. It always comes down to regional support. Professor John Blaxland, Director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute, always good talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Fauzi.